Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. I'm your host, Ash Sarkar, and it turns out it's ladies' night. The feeling is indeed right, and I'm joined by Moya Lothian-McLean. Moya, how you doing?
In fact, every time we're on together, you always say it's ladies' night. It's always ladies' night.
Well, look, I'm sorry that I define our dynamic by gender, all right? I know that it's not particularly progressive, but I do, and there's a song about it. I could also sing Here Come the Girls, but you wouldn't like that because I can't sing. Coming up later tonight, after purging left-wing candidates and MPs, we look at who Keir Starmer's Labour have deemed acceptable to allow into the fold. The Green Party have today launched their general election campaign in Bristol, and a certain British radio host has announced that they are running to be a Tory MP. Don't worry, it's not Michael Walker. Labour's purge of its political left continues apace, with more candidates being barred from contesting the upcoming general election. Diane Abbott, the long-standing representative of Hackney North and Stoke Newington, has had the Labour whip restored, but it's still unclear whether she'll be allowed to stand as Labour's candidate on July the 4th. Yesterday, it was briefed to the Times newspaper that the NEC would bar her from the Labour ballot. No official decision has been made yet, but it's not looking good. Lloyd Russell Moyle announced yesterday that he'd received an administrative suspension letter barring him from standing as Labour's candidate in the Brighton seat of Kemp Town and Peacehaven. According to Russell Moyle, this was prompted by, quote, a politically vexatious complaint regarding his behaviour 8 years ago. And while out campaigning with her 6-week-old infant in tow, Faiza Shaheen was informed by email that Labour had barred her from standing in Chingford and Woodford Green, citing her social media activity. A visibly shaken Shaheen appeared on Newsnight later that evening to speak with Victoria Derbyshire.
You got an email tonight. When?
Just like an hour ago.
Saying...
So basically, suddenly I'm I'm out campaigning and my phone's blowing up. They've briefed the press. They briefed the press before they even had the decency to call me and talk to me. There was a meeting yesterday. My baby cried through half of it, so I don't know how they came to a decision because I couldn't even hear their questions. 14 tweets since 2014, 10 years. 3 of those were like about the Green Party, me liking my friend's tweet before I joined the Labour Party. And one of them was about my experiences of Islamophobia in the party. Like, how am I not allowed to talk about my experiences of Islamophobia and the double standards that I've seen and that we see with Diane Abbott, for instance? I honestly, I'm just so shocked right now to be treated this badly after being such an active member of the party. And, we were one of the tiny number, 6 Tory-held seats in 2019 that had a swing to Labour. To act like I am some kind of person that can't, that isn't good at elections, that, that frustrates the Labour's purpose.
Normally like talking about someone's emotional state rather than talking about the politics. And we will come on to talking about the politics. But when you look at the emotional impact this has had on Faiza Shaheen, it's really difficult not to think of Labour's actions as being cruel, being vindictive, and spectacularly unkind. It feels like just such a humiliating way to treat someone who, regardless of what you think about them politically, has poured in, hours and hours and hours of their time and their effort, time that could have been spent just bonding with your infant at home, canvassing and fighting for your political party. It really, really is striking how much of an impact that's clearly had on Faiza Shaheen. This is another clip from the same interview in which Faiza Shaheen is confronted with the problematic tweet in question.
I'm going to put to you what the Jewish Labour movement said about one of the tweets that you liked. Nick mentioned it. And this is the quote: "We've received a number of complaints about the tweet that you liked from local Jewish members who are concerned about the tone of Ms. Shaheen's tweets. And the tweet that you liked talks about the Israel lobby. It says, every time you say something even mildly critical of Israel, you're immediately assailed by scores of hysterical people who explain to you why you're completely wrong, how you're biased against Israel. Moreover, you can't easily ignore them because those are not just random people. They tend to be friends or people who move in the same circles as you. Those people are mobilised by professional organisations.
So I do want to say that I don't remember liking this tweet. I was looking, if you see that tweet, it was a retweet of a Jon Stewart sketch. I watched the Jon Stewart sketch. But I wouldn't have even ordinarily liked that. Honestly, it was the middle of the night. If you look at the timing, I was probably with the baby breastfeeding. I don't even remember liking that tweet.
But you know what's wrong with it.
I know what's wrong with it, of course.
What is wrong with it?
The line that's there about they're in professional organisations, it plays into a trope, and I absolutely don't agree with that, and I'm sorry about that. And I expressed that I was sorry in that meeting yesterday over my crying baby. But, that's one tweet. I've organised an interfaith vigil with a local rabbi after the attacks, Hamas's attack, and brought the imam together. And I've done a lot of work. I have a lot of supporters. They wouldn't tell me how many Jewish members have messaged them, because I can tell you there's a lot more that would offer their support to me. The people that helped co-organise that interfaith vigil.
Let's look at the tweet and the video that's supposedly so out of line. Here's the tweet. The Israel lobby influences policy in various ways, but while people focus on campaign contributions, I don't think it's the main mechanism. If you ask me, this video perfectly illustrates how it more often works, which is far more mundane. Basically, every time you say something even mildly critical of Israel, you're immediately assailed by scores of hysterical people who explain to you why you're completely wrong, how you're biased against Israel, more or less explicitly accuse you of anti-Semitism, etc. And it just never stops. Moreover, you can't easily ignore them because those are not just random people. They tend to be friends or people who move in the same circles as you. Those people are mobilised by professional organisations, but to a large extent, that is organic. This non-stop harassment is just exhausting, and since most people don't really care about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they'll usually stop talking about it, or, if they're a politician, do whatever those people want them to do, rather than having to put up with it, because in the end, it doesn't cost them much. And now for the video attached to that tweet.
We'll start tonight in the Middle East, where Israel...
What? Israel isn't supposed to defend itself?
Oh, yeah, if Mexico bombed Texas, will we exercise
What other country is held to the same standard as Israel?
People that want to destroy our terrorists?
What is the matter with you? It's the only democracy in the Middle East, you turd!
Self-hating Jew?
That was weird. Anyway, what I was saying was last Thursday saw the start of a new ground offensive launched by Israel.
Tradition!
Holy look, obviously there are many strong opinions on this issue, but just merely mentioning Israel or questioning in any way the effectiveness or humanity of Israel's policies is not the same thing as being pro-Hamas.
So you're against murdered children?
Free Gaza! Free Palestine! Illegal occupation!
The Zionist pig!
You know what? Why don't we just talk about something lighter, like Ukraine?
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Look, as sketches go, this doesn't seem all that controversial to me. It's a fairly middle-of-the-road criticism of aggressive social media debate and how it's impossible to say anything about Israel or Palestine without being assigned malevolent motivations. And if a Jewish comedian making fun of that dynamic is anti-Semitic, well, let's just wrap it up here, lads. Show's over. In the Newsnight interview, Pfizer said that she's sorry for liking the tweet, that it made reference to an anti-Semitic trope, but that she was probably responding to the video itself. And look, personally, I don't think she has anything to be sorry for. If you want to stand there and say that Israel doesn't have aggressive online defenders, that those defenders aren't backed by professional organizations some of the time, and that Israel is somehow the only country on earth that doesn't have lobbyists, that's fine. Just don't expect me to take you seriously. Talking about the Jewish lobby is obviously anti-Semitic. However, talking about the Israel lobby isn't. It's a statement of fact. If there isn't an Israel lobby in the UK, then who the hell are the Labour and Conservative Friends of Israel? Who are, for that matter, We Believe in Israel? Who are the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre? And anyone who's shared material online that's supportive of Palestine or critical of Israel knows what it's like to be bombarded by hostile comments from pro-Israel accounts. And it seems crazy to me that you have to pretend that this dynamic doesn't exist. Otherwise, you'll be smeared as anti-Semitic. It's such an abuse of the concept of a trope. Because a racial trope is a disparaging repetitive image or narrative, like Jewish bankers or the Jewish lobby. What a trope isn't is a factually proven statement, like there is an active and aggressive Israel lobby. Anyway, here's what Jon Stewart himself has to say about the furore. This is the dumbest thing the UK has done since electing Boris Johnson. What the actual fuck? What the actual fuck, indeed. It looks like Pfizer Shaheen may be taking legal action against the Labour Party for how they've treated her. This is from Channel 4 News' Aisha Tull. New. I've been told Pfizer Shaheen has instructed a lawyer and is challenging the decision against her standing as a candidate. The lawyer claims Pfizer's well-being was not taken into consideration and described the Labour Party process as abhorrent, unprofessional, and unfair. So Moya, why do you think Pfizer Shaheen was really targeted here?
I just want to say what's happened to Pfizer Shaheen and what's happened to Lloyd Russell Moya, what's happened to Diane Abbott, what might be potentially happening to Afsana Begum, and also other politicians or prospective parliamentary candidates that we haven't seen yet cut out, but moves are being made behind the scenes against them, is disgusting. It makes an absolute mockery of even the pretense at democracy. And we've seen this iteration of the Labour Party do this before. We saw it with Jamie Driscoll. We've seen them block candidates from even appearing on the selection list. But to do it in such a manner, I've been calling it the night of the butter knives, Grey Labour's night of the butter knives. To do it in such like an egregious manner at this stage. And I think Pfizer Shaheen is a particularly horrifying example of just how much overreach this faction, the Labour right faction, has here. Because this is a candidate who has been selected once before, has basically been campaigning for the last 5 years, since her campaign in 2019. She hasn't stopped, and she's talked about this herself. She's been out there door knocking. She gave birth to her first child and was back out within 6 weeks after a C-section, knocking on doors. She has made every single effort to engage with that community where she was grown up. She also has fallen in line at every possible opportunity. So that's actually she's received critique from that from fellow left-wingers for her ability to try and compromise and contort herself into ever smaller shapes just to make sure that they didn't have any excuse to kick her out of the party. And she actually says this in the Newsnight interview. She says, I feel so foolish. Everyone said you're the last socialist sort of standing. It's amazing they haven't blocked you by now. They were just waiting for something to happen. And I wrote about this today as well. I think this whole mess, some people, some of the worst people you've ever seen in your life, have been celebrating this as, it's so impressive how Starmer is just, eradicating these people. He's really being ruthless. I don't think it's Starmer really at all. I think Starmer is actually very weak in all of this. And I think what this mess has exposed is how little control Starmer actually has over the kingmakers who put him there, over the people within Labour together, over Morgan McSweeney and co. Because what you had, especially with Diane Abbott, is these rogue briefings from the get-go. And according to the rumours, this is alleged, there's no confirmation. The rumours at first were Diane Abbott had been given back the whip so she could retire with dignity. She's supposedly going to be forced out. But then when there was this briefing to the Times that, no, she's been barred from standing, suddenly Diane was like, I'm not going anywhere. You know that scene in The Wolf of Wall Street where he's like, I'm not fucking leaving. Suddenly Diane was like, I'm not going anywhere. I want to be your MP, to a Hackney crowd. And this I think they called it on the newsagents, which for my sins I've been listening to during this election period, this tenuous deal that had potentially been made was completely rubbish because all these wranglings, these Labour wranglings were out in the open as a result of this rogue briefing, these rogue leaks. And a Labour insider I talked to today said, Keir Starmer is, he wants to run the country. He can't even run his office. He's not in control here. And we've seen this, like, why on earth would you move to block someone like Faiza Shaheen, who could be a real boon to your party and almost held up as a shield against a lot of the accusations and allegations of the sort of ruthless, undemocratic culture that's going on within the Labour right, who are the controlling faction at this moment in time. Someone who's very popular within her area, who's done like endless works of campaigning, building up networks, building up trust again from local activists and local constituents. Why on earth would you block her from standing? She's only ever fallen in line. She probably would only ever fall in line further and shape herself until she, completely agreed with the agenda handed on high. But no, they had to say, you're not going to be in the party, or rather, you're not going to stand for us. Not that she's expelled. You're not going to stand for us. That is overreach. That is really doubling down on a policy, and it's caused a massive amount of discontent within Labour across the political spectrum. And now what's going to happen is they're going to have to parachute someone else in if Faiza Shaheen doesn't manage to be selected on the 4th of June. And will that person be as good a quality candidate as Faiza Shaheen? Will they be able, sure, they might win the election, but will they be able to actually represent the constituents? Or will a load of people who've campaigned for Faiza, who've seen her treatment, be alienated, along with the local constituents who'll end up with an MP that's just, a Starmerite acolyte, who actually was not going to do anything for Chingford and Woodford Green, and 5 years down the line are completely disappointed in the broken promises of this Labour government and the way that they were stitched up? I don't know, lots to consider.
Jed Woods with a fiver who says, what Labour have done to Faiza Shaheen is disgusting. It goes without saying Labour have lost my vote. Great show tonight, guys. Thank you very much, Jed. And Gavin Bedford with a tenner. Have my next few months' Labour Party fees I'll no longer be spending. Thanks so much, Gavin. We appreciate it. If you want to support us over the long term, go to novaramedia.com/support. If you set up a monthly donation to us, it can help us cover this election differently and also build our media organisation for the long term. We really appreciate absolutely every penny we get. So no matter how little it is, we really, really do thank each and every one of you for it. Let's move on. Keir Starmer hasn't commented on Faiza Shaheen's exclusion by name, but he did talk to Sky News about candidate selection earlier today.
In terms of your candidate selections, 3 left-wing candidates now say they have been blocked from standing, and some people are suggesting that is a strategy. Are you blocking left-wing candidates from standing in this election?
No, I've said repeatedly over the last 2 years as we've selected our candidates that I want the highest quality candidates. That's been the position for a very long time.
This is pretty insulting. You might not agree with Faiza Shaheen's politics, and that's fair enough, but a working class woman who grew up with a violent father, getting a PhD and then a professorship and winning a grueling selection battle to be the candidate in her home constituency is anyone's definition of a high quality candidate. And that's before you consider the fact that she decreased a Tory majority in Chingford and Woodford Green when nationally there was a massive swing towards the Conservatives. So complete nonsense from Keir Starmer there. And in fact, a certain someone used to agree with me as well. This was Keir Starmer in 2019. Absolutely fantastic to hear Faiza Shaheen speak at our packed constituency meeting tonight. passion, expert understanding, and insight on inequality. Standing against IDS, that's Ian Duncan Smith, at the next election. What a great win that would be. And here's Keir Starmer again later that year. Pictured with Faiza Shaheen, he tweets, "Fantastic team, fantastic candidate, Faiza Shaheen. Great to join you today. #unseat IDS." Now look, maybe Faiza Shaheen became tragically and magically rubbish in the intervening years. Or maybe Keir Starmer doesn't care who gets screwed over as long as his right-wing faction tightened their stranglehold on the party. Here's Starmer's line today on Diane Abbott.
The situation in relation to Diane Abbott is that no decision has been taken to bar her. And, we have to remember that she was a trailblazer as an MP. She overcame incredible challenges to achieve what she's achieved in her political career. She literally sort of carved out the path for others to come into politics. And she did all that whilst also being one of the most abused MPs across all political parties. But I've always had the aspiration that we'll have the best quality candidates as we go into this election.
That's Starmer's line, but there's dissension in the ranks. This is what Deputy Leader Angela Rayner had to say to ITV News about the idea of barring Diane Abbott from standing as a Labour candidate.
Diane Abbott has apologised. She's done an anti-Semitism course. She's been readmitted to the party. And then there was a secret briefing that she's going to be banned from standing. Where's the due process in that?
Well, look, any briefings like that, I think, are disgraceful, and I don't accept that briefings like that should happen.
Do you know who did it?
I don't know who did that briefing, but I think, Diane Abbott has given 37 years of service to the Labour Party and also to the country. She's the first female Black MP that came into Parliament, and she's been a trailblazer. And for me, she is iconic in order to give people from her background the opportunity to say you can achieve great things as well. So I'm not happy that people brief out negatively about my colleagues. I don't think that's the way we should conduct ourselves.
And you and I are the same age. We were 7 when that historic moment happened. Do you think she should be able to stand if she wants to?
I don't see any reason why Diane Abbott can stand as an MP at the next general election because
you don't see any reason why she can't stand?
I don't see any reason why Diane Abbott can't stand as a Labour MP going forward. She's been cleared as part of an investigation. That is a process. I'm not involved in that process. And for me, I just see that if she wants to stand, then I don't see any reason why she can't stand.
That lays down the gauntlet for Keir Starmer. Now, it'll be the National Executive Committee, controlled by Starmer allies, who decide next week whether Diane Abbott can stand as a Labour candidate. But it's hard to imagine that the NEC would defy Keir Starmer's wishes either way. Meanwhile, Diane Abbott has made clear her intention to stand in Hackney North, either as a Labour candidate or as an independent MP if necessary. This is from a rally yesterday at Hackney Town Hall.
You have always stood with me in good times and bad, and I will always stand with you. I'm not going to allow myself to be intimidated. Forces beyond all of our control. I am going to be your MP.
Now, it hasn't just been the usual left-wing suspects coming out in support for Diane Abbott. Former Blair advisor John McTernan came out staunchly behind her in the Telegraph of all places. Here's what he had to say. There is a deeply misconceived, malevolent and wicked operation to humiliate Diane, and it is virtually impossible to detach that from the fact that she is a black woman. As the only black girl in her class at grammar school, and the only black woman in her class at Cambridge, and as a woman MP used to receiving perhaps half of all the abuse on Twitter directed at all women MPs, Diane knows the feeling and the force of difference. But it leaves a bitter taste when she receives it from the Party of Solidarity. It breaks my heart to see the way Diane is being treated. I say that as someone from a different wing of the Labour Party, but one who knows that all planes only fly with 2 wings. And I say it as a Londoner, proud of how the city has made itself globally great by fighting and defeating racism, the real enemy within. Those are incredibly strong words from John McTernan, and I'm glad that someone is pointing out that it's not a coincidence that Diane Abbott is being so poorly treated by the Labour Party, despite being the UK's first female black MP. In a way, it feels a bit like a ritual humiliation. She's being treated this way because she was the UK's first black female MP. And because she's a socialist as well, you can't have her end her career being celebrated. She has to be ground down and sort of forced into a political tomb. Moya, we've got a working class Muslim, a gay man, and Britain's first black female MP all being hung out to dry in different ways by Keir Starmer. How much of this has to do with identity and how much to do with politics?
That lead-in sounds like a really terrible joke, doesn't it? You've got a working class Muslim, a gay man, and Britain's first female MP all walk into the Labour Party. How badly can they be treated in one fell swoop? I mean, you ask how much does it have to do with identity versus politics? I know we rail against the idea of identity politics a lot of the time, but I don't think their identities are separate from their politics. These are left-wing, class-conscious, self-identified socialists who also belong to minority groups. And that is not a coincidence. Like, their backgrounds have shaped the way that they see the world and the politics that they practice. There are other members of, Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet, for example, who belong to minority groups, like David Lammy, who are not treated in the same way as these people. But I think when you look at their identity, it changes how, when on the receiving end of poor treatment, just how bad that treatment is. So people like Diane Abbott, people like Faiza Shaheen in particular, are seen as more disposable. And the constituents who they're imagined to represent, because it's not even necessarily like they might speak directly to a certain demographic. Often, if you belong to an identity group, you do seem to represent those kind of things. But there's other people, it's a broad group. It's not every black person in the country who's just going to ally themselves with Diane Abbott. There's plenty of people who are like, actually, I completely disagree with her politics. But this, in the minds of the, I hate to say it, the very, very white top brass who are now behind Labour, white and male, white cis male, this really does matter. The way they see it and the demographics they imagine these people having with them and being behind them and who they represent in their eyes, they're seen as disposable. They're seen as people that Labour can now afford to lose, or they imagine that they have this, they're so complacent and they're so racist. And I just will say it, they're so racist. They imagine that this will not matter. That they imagine the disgusting treatment that they're dishing out and the humiliation that they're dishing out, because that's what this is, will not matter to these sections of the electorate. And that even if it does, it's not a problem because they're going to win anyway. I remember that awful tweet. Who was it by who said, the fleas are leaving the ship now, or it was something like, let's get rid of the fleas. And it was talking specifically about people who were speaking out about Labour's position on Palestine, and the inaction from Labour's top brass on Palestine, which is one of the most dominant issues of our time and has only stepped up since tens of thousands of people are being murdered in Palestine, specifically in Gaza. And you compare the treatment of people like Diane Abbott, Faiza Shaheen, over either infractions that they've apologized for, or, there's nuances to the way they approach them, to someone like Neil Coyle's proven allegations of harassment and racism, a man he was suspended for 2 years, but he was let back in the party. He seems to be standing for selection again with absolutely no speed bumps in the road about whether that's the type of person that should be representing Labour. Meanwhile, you have Faiza Shaheen, this person who's kept her record so clean that all she can be pulled up on is some tweets about the Green Party before she joined Labour, and liking a tweet talking about, it doesn't even say Israeli lobby in that tweet that we talked about earlier. It says professional organisations. As we've said, what is Labour Friends of Israel? What is We Believe in Israel, if not professional organisations where it's a professionalised organisation. People are paid a salary to work at these places. What else is it? It's in the definition, it's a professional organisation. I do not understand how on earth that can be used as grounds to dismiss these people, unless you take into account as well that these people are seen as completely disposable. And in part, that is because of their identity characteristics. The fact they're left-wing comes into it. The fact they're from minority groups. You have all these different layers, and that's when we talk about intersectionality. So the treatment of someone like Lloyd Russell Moya is really bad. But then you look at the extra layers of humiliation that someone like Faiza Shaheen or Diane Abbott has suffered. And it's because of their gender identity, it's because of their racial identity interacting, and because they simply mean less. It's when there was that interview in the New York Times about how, actually it might be the New Yorker, how Joe Biden from a staffer says that, does Joe Biden care about Palestinian lives the same way he cares about Israeli lives? No. Simply put, these people at the top of Labour do not care about the likes of Muslim women or Black women within the party the same way they care about the people who look like them and come from the same backgrounds as them. And that is a built-in racism in society, but we're seeing it enacted on a really extreme level in Labour. And it's so distressing. It's going to alienate a huge crop of people that I don't think will return unless there is a change of leadership. And it will be really interesting to see how it plays out. But I do worry as well, and I've talked about this in the article I wrote today, I worry where those voters or potential voters who would have previously aligned to Labour will go, because I worry that the only parties out there that are making a case, have a really great pro-Palestine stance, for example, also are coming with, you have the Greens, which they're good, and we're going to talk about them later. But there's parties like George Galloway's party, which I'll just say, Workers' Party of Great Britain, which preaches a really good game on some issues, really strong. But then on other issues, throws, for example, a really aggressive anti-climate change agenda, which I don't think can be part of a political party in the 2020s, when that's one of the greatest crises facing us, and it threatens all of us. Palestine is a climate issue as well. US imperialism, these are all massive issues that play into that, as well as also a party that is very, they preach a social conservatism, but that social conservatism is expressed in terms of anti-LGBTQ people's rights to have, the same level of recognition as normal or equal to other people. And they talk about traditional families, this idea of traditional. They say we want to shut down, this sweeping wave of transgenderism that's coming across the country. I don't think I'll just say it out flat out, that has no place in a left-wing movement. Either we're all equal and none of us are equal. And I don't want us to make the mistakes of, because somewhere like Labour is alienating voters and alienating these minority groups, we go elsewhere where some parties are saying some things we want to hear, and then we ignore the unsavoury bits because we're making the same mistakes that somewhere like Labour's doing, which is, oh, if I'm not a member of that minority group, it doesn't affect me and I don't care as much. We have to make ourselves care. You have to make yourself understand that everyone is equal to you. Otherwise, I do not think we have a claim to building the kind of leftism that can actually oppose this real Labour right faction.
We've talked a lot about the candidates blocked by Labour from standing at the general election. But let's have a look at someone they did deem acceptable. Meet Luke Akehurst. He's a member of Labour's National Executive Committee, who've recently been deciding candidates to be imposed on constituencies for the general election. And would you believe it? He's been appointed as Labour's candidate for North Durham. Funny that. If running for office hasn't kept Akehurst busy enough, he's also spent the last 30 days deleting more than 1,300 tweets. We'll get into some of them in a second. And if you're very online, Luke Akehurst might be a familiar name to you. Since 2011, he's been the director of We Believe in Israel, an outgrowth of the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre. He describes himself as a committed Zionist, but he isn't himself Jewish. And as you might expect, he's dedicated his personal Twitter account to the cause of Israeli PR. That's going to go down well at a time when Labour has lost councillors and voters over its handling of the genocidal assault on Gaza. Here's what he had to say in October about possible breaches of international law in the early days of the siege. I don't believe that anything Israel is doing is in breach of any of those points. It is all proportional to achieving a legitimate military objective. Israel's command structure involves sign-off by lawyers to ensure conformity with international law for all IDF actions. He's also very particular on how not to describe Israel's military activities. Again, this is from Twitter. Very serious words that have specific meaning and impact being thrown around in regard to Gaza. Genocide, ethnic cleansing, disproportionate, carpet bombing. None of these things is happening in Gaza. You want to criticize Israeli airstrikes? Do so, but be accurate. That's almost comical. You can criticize Israeli airstrikes, but you can't even call them disproportionate. So, lovely precision bombing that just happens to wipe out whole families in residential tower blocks, eh? David Lammy has been touring the world, laying out his vision for how Labour's foreign policy might look. But I don't know how that lines up with a potential Labour MP branding the United Nations anti-Semitic, as Luke Akehurst did on Twitter. Despite both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch stating that Israel meets the legal definition of apartheid, the paid Israel lobbyist begs to differ. Again, this is on Twitter. Apartheid South Africa was an evil racist state, and Israel is a multicultural democracy protecting itself after a genocidal terrorist attack. Okay, so you can call October 7th genocidal, you just can't call the military assault, which is being looked at by the ICJ as a case of genocide. You can't call that genocidal. But Luke Akehurst's interests extend far beyond the Middle East. The part-time field marshal offered this when asked how the UK would practically use its nukes. Trident could be used as anything from one warhead in an uninhabited area as a warning shot to 40 aimed at cities. 40 aimed at cities. He didn't mention the bit where potentially millions of people would be incinerated, or worst case scenario, we end up with global annihilation. And when not wargaming, tactical use of nukes, Luke Akehurst can be found ventriloquizing all the Vietnamese people he's ever met. The Vietnam War is definitely the one where America were the good guys, right? Don't spoil it. I haven't actually watched Apocalypse Now. So that's Luke Akehurst tweeting in agreement that he's the guy who believes that America were the good guys in Vietnam. Yep, and so do all the Vietnamese people I've met. Anyway, that's not the only incredibly moral and successful war Luke Akehurst has supported. Here are his thoughts on Iraq from when he was running for an NEC spot. Do you believe the Iraq War was justifiable? If yes, why? If no, what do you believe Labour policy should be to address the wrong? Luke Akehurst responds, yes. I supported the Iraq War because Iraq under Saddam presented a unique geopolitical threat, given that it had a proven know-how on building nuclear, chemical, and biological WMD, a regime that had no compunction in using chemical weapons against the Kurds at Halabja, and access to ballistic missiles from North Korea. That threat was removed by the overthrow of Saddam. The fall of the Ba'athist regime also removed from power a murderous dictator who killed perhaps 250,000 of his own citizens and removed the threat of genocide from the Iraqi Kurds and the Shiite Marsh Arabs. Moya. What does it say that Starmer's Labour have selected a professional lobbyist for Israel at this particular time?
He is a nasty character, I will say that. Luke Akehurst is, he has run for Labour before on 2 different occasions, and he wasn't elected on either of them because he was fielded, I think, in Hampshire and Essex, and I think beaten, definitely in Essex, by a Tory candidate. So this isn't the first time he's been selected. This is the first time he's been selected for a safe Labour seat, though. Which North Durham is. And I don't know if Luke Akehurst has ever been to Durham. He lives in Oxford and has spent most of his life since graduating from Bristol down in the south. He's always been south. He's worked for, various Labour councils in Hackney, etc. During his tenure. He also was a big management consultant. So his biography is one of what is shaping up to be quite a classic Starmer faction. And I keep saying Starmer faction because it's not even Starmer ally. We keep calling them Starmer allies, but what I want to make clear is I do not think Starmer is really running the show. He is the figurehead. He was the person approached by Morgan McSweeney in 2019 and said, we're going to, we need to rebuild Labour. We need to take over Labour. I think you're the man for the job. But Labour Together had been functioning before that. Wes Streeting, Rachel Reeves have been part of it, this think tank. They're the ones who parachuted Starmer into the leadership role. But I don't think Starmer himself, we've seen him, he's not a talented politician. He doesn't have very good political instincts. His grasp on strategy is woeful. And he's also not, like Ed Miliband said, he's not tough enough. Like, he's not tough enough at all. But he's got these people behind him who are very hard-nosed, who are very tough, and who are willing to do whatever. And Luke Akehurst is one of the type of people that fits right in with this faction. He's always been, I'll just say, he's always been quite an odious person, an odious character. And I'm sad that the rest of the world will now be aware of who this is. The rest of Britain will be aware, well, at least England will be aware of who Luke Akehurst is. I mean, it says a huge amount that in the middle of a genocide, that he is being parachuted into the safe seat. But I also think it says a huge amount about the general culture of candidates being picked. It's fascinating to see, and I do think it's a further example of that overreach we were talking about earlier by this faction. There is a real arrogance there that is undermining the canniness of the political strategy that has gone before. Although I move fast, move hard, and just crush everyone in your path, is that really that canny political strategy? But the candidates they are picking, the Luke Akehursts, there's Josh Simons, who's literally the director of Labour Together, who's now going for a safe seat, I think, in Mansfield. There's other, the Paul Wall, the journalist, who's now running in Rochdale. There's Georgia Gould, who was the leader of Camden Council, famous for refusing to give tents to the homeless, now running for a seat as well. They've all been parachuting these candidacies without consultation with the local constituency parties, without that grassroots input, just straight from the NEC, because they rigged the rules last year to make it so that they could do this and they could rig the selection process. These candidates have been put in place at very short notice. We saw it in Islington North as well. They quickly selected, when they barred Jeremy from standing, they quickly selected a candidate who happened to be a health tech company, private health company CEO. Parachute these people in, and some of them really have checkered pasts. They are not people that, if you were a canny political strategist, you would want front and center. They're the people you want in the back rooms doing like the dirty work, doing the sort of like networking, the kind of stuff that Luke Akehurst has been doing for the last 10 years on behalf of Labour. They're not the kind of people you want exposed with their bellies out so that various, political enemies or whatever can have a pop at them, because there are skeletons in their closet that will be found. But it shows the arrogance, it shows the overreach, because now these people are being put in as politicians. And it's just as corrupt as what the Tories have been doing for the last X amount of years. It's just as low caliber of people being put in place to represent constituencies that didn't even select them in the first place. It's the same sort of like, I think even the Tory party, I don't even know the Tory party has rigged the selection process as badly as this. But it's the same sort of low quality candidates. And we're going to get people who mirror, the Scott Bentons that we saw in Blackpool South. We're going to get people who mirror the Owen Pattersons, because these people are real naked careers and they're used to making money in their other jobs, and they're used to getting their way, and they're used to playing this game of machinations, and they frankly do not give a toss about their constituents or their prospective constituents, because they've tried in 6 different places to get parachuted in. And they've, if you stand in various different constituencies for X amount of time, do you care about those people? Do you have any connection to those people? And last minute, suddenly you get a place, in North Durham, and the election's in 5 weeks. Do you care about North Durham at all? No, you care about something else, and that something else is you and your career. So it's not just that Luke Akehurst is an Israeli lobbyist, which is massively significant about where Starmer stands, or where Starmer's faction stands, and what they care about. But it's also that in general, the lobbying culture around Labour is just stacked high now with people who have these business links, who have these links to these organizations that it's all like, money changing hands. And it's, I think, two of the Labour Together board now have links to like Alone, Big Pharma, Rail, the asset management fund that gutted Thames Water, and there's and energy firms. Just 2 alone have all those different links through their lobbying contacts, through the fact that one of them is a chair of a lobbying firm and the other is an ex-lobbying consultant. And these are the kind of people that the top of Labour is now being stacked with. That's what it says. It says that Labour, at least the faction in charge of Labour, are so much more concerned with these connections to keeping up the status quo, keeping the flow of capital going to them, their mates, and these big companies, and militarized nations that are enacting a genocide, rather than the people on the ground. I don't want to be too doom and gloom, because I'm sure things will get slightly better under Labour. There will be tangible changes compared to the Tories. But I do think Labour is on a trajectory, the same way that Manchester's on a trajectory similar to London was, in which you can see all the warning signs of it going down the exact same path. And in 10 years, when it's absolutely hollowed out and, no one's living in the city centre and Labour stands for absolutely nothing and they're doing the same sort of crap that the Tories are now, we can say, well, we saw it coming. We saw these routes coming right now. And we predicted it and none of you listened.
Well, I think there's kind of a quid pro quo there, right? So Labour government, you might get reduced NHS waiting lists, and that's very good. But the rates of hospital admissions for terrible head injuries goes up, because every time you see Luke Akehurst on TV, you're compelled to headbutt the screen. So, how do you balance those two things? However, if there's one thing me and Luke Akehurst can agree on, it's on power grabs in the Labour Party. Here he is talking about deselections in 2018. A big component of deselection fever is careerism, people trying to grab jobs as MPs and councillors during narrow window while their faction has power in the party nationally. Couldn't put it better myself. The Green Party has launched its general election campaign in Bristol. That's where they're hoping to snatch the new seat of Bristol Central from Labour incumbent and shadow cabinet minister Thangham Debonair. The Bristol seat is just one of the 4, or more, they're hoping to win this election on a manifesto built around climate change and the environment. This was co-leader Carla Denyer laying out the Green Party's key commitments.
The Conservatives are clearly on their way out of government, but Labour is failing to offer the real change needed. We have the practical solutions to the cost of living crisis, building new affordable homes, protecting our NHS from creeping privatisation, and cleaning up our toxic rivers and seas. That's why it's so important that when Labour form the next government, they are pushed beyond the timid change they are offering. Pushed to be more ambitious, braver, not to skirt around the edges of the massive crises facing our country, but to actually make real change that benefits people's lives every day. That's what Green MPs can do.
As Denyer said there, the Greens are explicitly courting left-wing voters disillusioned with Labour leader Keir Starmer's timid approach to our biggest problems. But they're also targeting Tory voters in rural constituencies, people who care about their local environment. That could be a recipe for an interesting internal tension at best and possible incoherence at worst, as the party looks to attract both the left Labour and the countryside Tory vote. One issue that might serve as a bridge, though, is the NHS. This was Greens co-leader Adrian Ramsey on their plans for the health service.
When it comes to healthcare, that means defending and restoring our NHS. Because our hospitals are full of patients in corridors, with staff severely overstretched and too many people not getting the treatment that they need. And yet Labour, rather than pledging the investment needed, is saying, wait for growth, allow more access for private companies. We need real solutions. Free healthcare is a fundamental principle held dear by Brits up and down the country, and we'd make sure it's funded properly so that everybody can see an NHS dentist and doctor when they need one. We will make the tax system fairer so that we can afford to invest in the people who work in our hospitals and GP surgeries, so that they stay here, bringing down waiting lists so people don't miss out on life-saving operations. With more Greens in the next Parliament, you can be sure of a voice for real hope and real change for our health service.
The Greens haven't said what that fairer taxation system would look like yet, though in January they called for a wealth tax. But Ramsey has said their planned reforms would raise an extra £50 billion from the country's richest, making the Greens the only party to tell the nation that taxes, at least for the rich, will have to go up. Another big Green pledge is on housing. They've promised to build 150,000 new council homes, end right to buy and no-fault evictions, and introduce rent controls. They've also promised to clean up our waterways, having repeatedly called for the water companies to be brought into public ownership. And it's hard to imagine a more popular policy across all demographics. Moya, what do you make of the Greens' policy platform? Like, don't like?
I feel like viewers know enough about me and my politics by now to know this obviously is going to appeal to someone like me. What I'm more interested in is how are the Greens going to get the message out there really en masse? Because I'm pretty plugged in. I try not to be plugged in. I'm way too plugged in for my mental health, but I'm pretty plugged in. And yet the Greens are up against it because they don't really appear on the shows. They haven't really got this dynamic message, and it shouldn't be about that. It shouldn't be about the optics or the delivery, etc. And they have great communicators, but for some reason there's something not clicking in the way the message is actually getting out to people. And maybe I'm completely disconnected from that because I'm not in one of the areas where they're targeting. And if you go to Bristol, you go to North Herefordshire, which is where I'm originally from. I'll go up and ask my mum this weekend. Then you'll hear that. You'll hear the buzz. You might hear it around the Greens, but I'm not seeing it cut through as much in my demographics. But perhaps that's also because the youth are already kind of sewn up, so they don't need to focus on us, and they don't need to focus on these big social media campaigns. I'm really interested in seeing what the Greens will do, which I think we'll talk about a bit more later. But I think the policy platform's great. I just wish there was more. I wish there was more materials out there that was delivering it in a way that was really cutting through. But I could also just be removed from that. So that is a completely subjective opinion.
There does seem to be a broader issue with cut through and name recognition. Both Carla Denyer and Adrian Ramsey polled below a made-up candidate name in name recognition. So they've got a bit of a way to go there. So what chance do the Greens stand in this general election? Well, their message does seem to be cutting through, at least with younger voters. For voters aged 18 to 24, the Greens are now the second most popular party by quite some distance, with the Tories and Lib Dems trailing by around 16 points. And when it comes to the huge group of voters between 25 and 50, the Greens are now neck and neck with the Tories and about a point ahead of the Lib Dems. That YouGov polling shows how far the Tories have fallen amongst the majority of voters, but it does also show how much the Greens have gained. Popular vote share doesn't tell you much about parliamentary results in a general election, though. Thank you, first past the post. But it can be indicative. In 2019, the Greens returned a single MP, Caroline Lucas, to Parliament with just over 2.5% of the vote share. The Lib Dems, on the other hand, returned 11 with just over 11% of the vote share. Sorry, I said that really weirdly. With just over 11% of the vote share. At the moment, the Greens look on course to match the Lib Dems' 2019 vote share. And while they're aiming to stand candidates in every seat, they're concentrating their campaign on just 4. In 2019, Brighton Pavilion returned Caroline Lucas to Parliament with 57% of the vote. This election, Sian Berry will be standing following Lucas's retirement. Then there's the new seat of Bristol Central, where Greens co-leader Carla Denyer will try to take the seat from Labour's Thangham Debonair. Debonair won a majority of 62% in 2019, way down on the numbers she saw in the Corbyn heyday. What followed was a massive purge of left-wingers from the Bristol Labour Party, with membership dropping as people left the party following Starmer's swing to the right. So there are ample voters looking for a more radical agenda for the Greens to pick up in the constituency. The Greens' other co-leader, Adrian Ramsey, is running in rural Waveney Valley, a seat straddling the Suffolk-Norfolk border. Previously a Tory stronghold, it seems an unlikely spot for the Greens, but the party has sided with locals who've been battling the government over plans to build a 112-mile-long power line through farmland and gardens. Finally, former member of the European Parliament, Ellie Chowns, will be standing in North Herefordshire, another Tory seat. The Greens' own polling of the constituency have them at 30% of the vote share, just 1% behind Tory incumbent Bill Wiggins. Now, the Greens are being pretty ambitious for this election, and they appear to be emerging as a reasonable force in British politics. But has it come out of the blue? Not really. In the local elections earlier this year, the Greens achieved their highest ever number of councillors. They also showed the highest growth in the number of councillors, increasing their number by 70%. That was the largest growth seen by any party. In 2023, the Greens made record gains too, winning 241 new seats and gaining control of Mid-Suffolk District Council. Again, that was the highest growth shown by any party, more than doubling their previous number. Local elections are one thing, but what about the generals? In 2010, the Greens won less than 1% of the vote share and only around 280,000 votes. But in 2015, that all changed. The Greens quadrupled their votes, gaining well over 1 million, but they were still able to return only one MP, leading to renewed focus on Britain's unrepresentative electoral system. In 2015, the Greens focused on anti-austerity measures and the promise of a more equal, greener, and humane society. And for younger voters, climate change was increasingly a major issue. But the progress of the Greens towards a larger parliamentary presence was hindered at the 2017 election by Corbynism's youthquake. That election saw the Greens' vote share halve as young left-wing voters returned to Labour. In 2019, they did slightly better, but still failing to reach the highs of 2015. So, what's changed in the last 5 years? A lot. First, the Labour Party has made itself hostile to even those moderately left-wing voters who want a more just economy and a democratic society. But second, climate change. Its effects are increasingly seen and felt, and there's a greater understanding of how tackling climate catastrophe will mean more radical economic, political, and social reforms. Young people understand this, and even some Tory voters get it too. The Labour Party has so far resisted talking about that, pretending instead that capitalism can still solve capitalism's crisis via private investment in green infrastructure. The Green Party, though, seems to be thinking bigger. Moya, what are your expectations of the Green Party's performance in the general election, and what do you think their strategy ought to be, if not the one they've got now?
You're asking me 2 questions I always refuse to answer. You're asking me to make a prediction about how a political party will do, and you're asking me to give advice to a political party of strategy when you know that I exist in a London media bubble, Ash. God, you're just going to embarrass me in front of everyone. It's difficult with the Greens and their performance. Obviously, they've massively whacked up the amount of councillors they have, but they didn't take any new councils in the local elections where you would have kind of expected that to happen if there was going to be massive gains. They've got Brighton, but now Caroline Lucas is going, so you've got Sian Berry coming in, who is a totally new face. Again, I talked a bit earlier about, disconnect from constituents. Do Brighton constituents know Sian Berry? Do they trust Sian Berry? Will the Green moniker be enough to carry it for her? I presume so, but just because when I slag off Labour for parachuting people in, doesn't mean that doesn't apply to parties that I might be more aligned to at this point in time. I still think there is a real problem with moving candidates around who may not have connections to the areas that they want to represent. That's difficult. That's a problem. That creates disconnect and it creates distrust. Whereas someone like Ellie Chowns, she's lived in North Herefordshire for 20 years. She's been, on the doorsteps. As I've said before, I think my mum's been doing some campaigning for her just to announce my extra biases while I'm here. But that's someone who literally is very ingrained in the area. She has an organic farm there. She knows about farming. She really can speak to the potential constituents, although whether that will be enough to overturn Bill Wiggins' majority. North Herefordshire is a very Tory constituency. It's a very Tory constituency. It's one that has endured as a Tory constituency despite the absolute uselessness of Bill Wiggin and the dissatisfaction that people have with Sir Bill there. Over X amount of years he's represented the seat. It is an uphill battle. I know that in South Herefordshire, Jessie Norman, who's also a Tory, is looking to be unseated by the Lib Dems, I believe, which is also going to be an interesting battle. For once, Herefordshire's on the map. not Hertfordshire, as you insisted on calling it, Ash. But yeah, it's difficult. I can't predict this stuff because you don't know what people are going to do on the day. You don't know if they're going to panic or not. I think Brighton's probably the only seat where I'd say, yeah, they're definitely going to take it. Bristol, maybe because of the complete green swing and the collapse of Labour, trust in Labour, every level from the mayoralty to the sort of council level. As far as strategy goes, again, as I said earlier, it's an uphill battle because the Greens, they don't get the TV slots that someone like Reform, a party like Reform does, despite the fact that they have far more influence at this point over actual politics, with the local councils, etc. And the fact they actually have an MP. But you see Nigel Farage on the TV all the time. He's not even standing. So strategy-wise, I wonder if they need to cut through more with a more coherent, maybe they need narrative. Maybe they do need to have someone like Zach Polansky more repeatedly front and center, despite not being the leader. He's one of the best communicators they've got. But they'll be working it out. And I think Michael and I talked about this earlier. I think the Greens are going to be an extra big player at the next election, sadly, and maybe this one is sort of laying the ground. But we will see, because I know a lot of disaffected young people will vote for them. It's whether those votes stay, because unfortunately, young people like me tend to be quite fickle, and we can switch between parties every 5 years. So we'll see if that's a consistent thing and we stick with Greens. It will depend on the message. It will depend on whether they can start delivering what feels like a coherent, really strong package, and also momentum, because people do go with momentum. People like to back who they think they see as winners. It's a silly system, but that's what it is.
LBC radio host Iain Dale has left his day job to run for Parliament. He'll be standing as the Conservative candidate in Tunbridge Wells. Now, you can't really imagine a safer Tory seat. Tunbridge Wells is one of the wealthiest constituencies in the country and has had a Tory MP since 1974. But perhaps Iain Dale has done the impossible and made it a little less safe after this audio from 2022 emerged.
I have lived in Tunbridge Wells since 1997, slightly against my will, in that my partner comes from Tunbridge Wells and can't really imagine living anywhere else. I've never liked the place, still don't, and would happily live somewhere else.
I kind of identify with that because I'm always mouthing off about different places in this country. Podcasting is a dangerous game. The audio is from Dale's political podcast For the Many, which he hosts with former Labour MP Jackie Smith. A moment that Dale is also famous for is this from a 2013 Sky News report.
You may recall these images from the Labour Party conference in Brighton on Tuesday.
Sorry, I think if
so you can see a protester being slightly wrestled by the blogger Iain Dale. Well, he's the publisher of course, Damien McBride, the former Spin Doctor's book. He has received a police caution after admitting common assault over this scuffle with the protester during, as you can see, this live television interview in Brighton. Mr. Dale has released a pretty fulsome apology. He says he wants to issue this public apology for his behaviour. He wants to apologise and say sorry to Stuart Holmes. This was, of course, the campaigner that he was trying to wrestle to the ground. He also wants to apologise for the blog post he wrote after the incident. He says it was full of absurd bravado, and in the heat of the moment he behaved in a frankly idiotic way. He says he's embarrassed not only himself but his family and his work colleagues, and he apologises to them also. He also apologises to the Labour leader Ed Miliband, and says that he did apologise personally to Mr. Holmes on Tuesday afternoon. And he says that he agreed to let the matter rest.
Never really seen how long that goes on for. I mean, look, that's definitely assault and he accepted a caution, but there's also something about that particular kind of grappling scuffle, which to me seems incredibly English and a bit thick of it. Moya, there's a bit of me, as I said, that can identify with speaking a bit too frankly. Iain Dale, is he all of us?
At least he lives in Tunbridge Wells. At least he lives there. I don't want, you put me in a position where I feel a bit like I have to slightly defend Iain Dale, which is one of the worst and most uncomfortable positions I've ever been in. One thing I'll say is he lives in Tunbridge Wells. He doesn't like Tunbridge Wells. That's fine. A lot of people who live there might not like the place they live, because the problem is, what is the solutions for that? So if you live somewhere and you don't like what's happened to the place, you don't like the infrastructure that's been taken away from you, you don't like how it's been neglected and, underfunded, and you have robust solutions for that, and you have ideas about how to rebuild, community, and, well, I'm going to campaign on your behalf so that you have affordable housing built. I'm going to campaign so that we have more community centres built. I'm going to campaign so that we actually get, the trains stop here more often. That is the mark of a good politician, right? But if he's campaigning, saying, I don't like Tunbridge Wells and it's, I don't know, X group that makes it bad, or this is the reason we need to, cut taxes more, or we need to let Amazon build something. I don't know his policy platform, his hyper-local policy platform. Then that's a different matter, because I don't think it's a crime to not like where you live. I think a lot of people are dissatisfied with where they live because of what's happened over the last 14 years. Especially in localities that are outside like the big urban areas, what's happened to these places. But the solutions and the analysis of why that has happened and why the place you live might not feel, as comfortable or as or like it's been neglected. The solutions to that is what differentiates political ideology. So I'd have to see what Iain Dale's saying. And as for the fight, it's a scuffle. I mean, he's attacking a protester, and I completely disagree with what he's doing, or why he's attacking a protester. I'm aligned with the protester, but it's a fight that happened over 10 years ago now. And I don't know if he fully apologised for it, received a caution, if the protester was compensated. I don't think on the scale of the bad things that Tory candidates have done, it actually ranks as highly or something that I would take notice of. But my main point is this, Iain Dale doesn't like the place he lives. But what's his analysis of why, and what's the solution, and how will that benefit the people he wants to represent?
Well, I don't know. I slag off places all the time. And I think maybe there's an element of you criticize places the way you criticize your family. So it's fine when you criticize your own family or you criticize the place where you live. But if someone else joins in, you're like, fuck you, stop agreeing with me so hard. Anyway, that's all for us tonight. Thank you, Moya, so much for joining me for a slightly longer show than normal, but I think the people liked it.
Thank you, Ash. I love co-hosting. Maybe they'll let me co-host more. I don't always need to be in the big chair, I'm a small person.
I love the big chair. It makes me feel like Commander Riker. And thanks everyone for watching this evening. Come back tomorrow for now. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.